The court records of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, document 4 separate deaths that occurred between 1837 and 1841. There was a lawyer who fell from his horse on a foggy morning, a banker found in the shallow waters of Mill Creek, a circuit judge who died from a sudden illness during harvest season, and a county sheriff discovered at the bottom of his own well. What those records don't reveal is that all 4 men had been married to sisters from the same Irish Catholic family, and that each death happened within 18 months of their respective weddings. The Brennan sisters, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah, inherited the largest farm in Lancaster County, and they were willing to kill to keep it whole. Before we continue with the story of the Brennan family farm and the 4 widows who refused to be separated, let me tell you about the summer of 1836 when everything changed for the Brennan sisters, and a conversation by candlelight sealed the fate of 4 prominent men. The Brennan family farm spanned 847 acres of Pennsylvania's most fertile soil, with Mill Creek to the north and the Lancaster Pike to the south. Patrick Brennan, who arrived from County Cork with nothing but determination and a hatred of English landlords, spent 37 years building his American dynasty. By 1836, his property was worth more than most small towns, complete with a grand stone house that rivaled any in Philadelphia, barns that could shelter 200 head of cattle, and grain silos that fed half the county through harsh winters. But Patrick Brennan died that October with a problem that would have destroyed lesser families. Pennsylvania inheritance statutes dictated that a man's property be divided equally among his children upon his death. Patrick had no sons. His 4 daughters, Bridget, 28, Catherine, 26, Margaret, 24, and Sarah, 21, faced the prospect of watching their father's life work carved into worthless fragments, sold off to satisfy creditors and tax collectors. The sisters had grown up knowing this day would come. Patrick had drilled into them the importance of the land, telling them stories of their grandfather's eviction from Irish soil, of families scattered to the winds when property changed hands. Land is not just dirt and stones, he would say. His accent was still thick after decades in America. Land is your blood, your future, your very soul. Lose the land, and you lose everything that makes you who you are. In 1836, Lancaster County was a place where such sentiments carried weight. The German and Irish farmers who had settled there understood the sacred nature of property ownership in a way that newer Americans, those whose families had always owned land, never could. But understanding the importance of keeping land and actually managing to do so were 2 very different challenges. The Brennan sisters were not ordinary farm women. Bridget, the eldest, possessed a sharp intelligence that she had learned to hide behind demure smiles and downcast eyes. She could calculate compound interest faster than most bankers and had been secretly managing the farm's books since her father's eyesight began failing. Catherine had inherited her father's gift for reading people, for sensing their weaknesses and desires with an almost supernatural precision. Margaret possessed an ethereal beauty that made men forget their own names, combined with a ruthless practicality that her angelic face concealed perfectly. Sarah, the youngest, had been blessed with a voice that could charm birds from trees and a talent for playing whatever role the situation demanded. Together, they formed a conspiracy of survival that would make Lancaster County history. Though the true nature of their conspiracy would remain hidden for nearly a century, the plan emerged during the long nights following their father's funeral when the sisters gathered in the kitchen by lamplight to confront their future. The property taxes alone would consume their savings within 2 years. Marriage, the traditional solution for property-less women, would scatter them to different households, different names, different loyalties. But what if marriage could serve their purposes instead of destroying them? "We stay together," Bridget declared on a November evening when frost covered the windows and the fire cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. "Whatever it takes, we stay together and we keep the farm whole." "The law says differently," Margaret pointed out, ever practical. "The law," Catherine said slowly, "can be influenced." It was Sarah who spoke the words that would damn them all. "Men die, sisters. Husbands die, and widows inherit everything." The first death occurred on March 15th, 1838, just 14 months after Patrick Brennan's funeral and 6 months after Bridget's marriage to Thomas Hennessy, the most prominent attorney in Lancaster County. Hennessy had been a logical choice. A successful Irish Catholic lawyer in his early 40s, a widower with no children, a man wealthy enough to pay the Brennan property taxes without blinking, and influential enough to help restructure the family's legal obligations. Their courtship had been brief but intense. Hennessy, who had been a bachelor for 3 years since his first wife's death from consumption, found himself completely enchanted by Bridget's combination of beauty and intelligence. She could discuss legal precedents with the same ease that she planned elaborate dinner parties. She laughed at his stories of courtroom victories and listened intently to his dreams of running for county judge. Within 2 months of their first meeting at Sunday Mass, Thomas Hennessy was convinced that Bridget Brennan was the answer to his lonely prayers. The wedding took place in December 1837, a grand affair that announced to Lancaster County society that the Brennan family fortunes were secure. Hennessy moved into the stone farmhouse, bringing with him not only his considerable wealth, but also his legal expertise in restructuring the property ownership to benefit all 4 sisters. The arrangement was complicated but legal, a family trust that kept the land intact while providing for each sister's future security. But Thomas Hennessy had underestimated his new wife's true priorities. Within weeks of the wedding, he began to notice disturbing patterns. Bridget seemed more interested in her sister's welfare than in their marriage. She insisted that Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah continue living in the main house, turning what should have been a honeymoon period into an extended family gathering. When Hennessy suggested that newlyweds might benefit from privacy, Bridget's response was swift and cold. "My sisters are my blood, Thomas. They stay." The tension escalated when Hennessy discovered that Bridget had been using his legal connections to investigate the financial situations of several prominent Lancaster County bachelors. When confronted, she claimed she was merely looking out for her sister's futures. But Hennessy sensed something more calculating in her behavior. The morning of March 15th began with an argument. Hennessy had received an offer to purchase a law practice in Philadelphia, an opportunity that would advance his career considerably, but require leaving Lancaster County. When he presented the idea to Bridget over breakfast, her reaction was immediate and vehement. "We're not leaving," she stated flatly, not looking up from her porridge. "This is our future, Bridget. A chance to build something bigger than a country law practice. Our future is here. This land, this farm, my sisters. Your sisters can visit us in Philadelphia. They can even come live with us once they're married." Bridget finally looked at him, and Hennessy later told his law clerk that her expression had frightened him. "You don't understand, do you, Thomas? We don't leave. We don't separate ever." The argument continued as Hennessy prepared to ride to his office in Lancaster town. The morning was thick with fog, unusual for March, but not unprecedented in Pennsylvania's unpredictable spring weather. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices from the Brennan house, though the fog muffled the specific words. At approximately 9:30 that morning, Thomas Hennessy's horse returned to the farmhouse without its rider. The animal was sweating heavily, its eyes wide with what appeared to be terror. Bridget immediately organized a search party, her distress appearing genuine and overwhelming. They found Hennessy's body 3 hours later, sprawled beside the main road approximately half a mile from a farm, his neck broken from what appeared to be a catastrophic fall from his horse. The county coroner, Dr. James Mallister, conducted a thorough examination. The injuries were consistent with a fall from horseback, a broken neck, contusions on the skull, and bruising that suggested the horse had stepped on Hennessy's chest after throwing him. The fog would have made the familiar road treacherous, and Hennessy's mare was known to be skittish around sudden sounds or movements. But several details troubled those who knew the couple well. Hennessy was an experienced horseman who had ridden that same route hundreds of times in all weather conditions. More puzzling was the horse's condition when it returned. The animal showed signs of extreme agitation that seemed excessive for a simple fall. Most disturbing of all was Bridget's reaction. While her grief appeared genuine, her immediate concern seemed to focus on practical matters. securing Hennessy's will, consolidating his assets, and ensuring that his legal arrangement for the farm remained intact. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners. Thomas Hennessy had been well respected in Lancaster County legal circles, and his sudden death shocked the community. Bridget played the role of grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences with appropriate tears and dignity. But those closest to the family noticed that her sisters seemed less like mourners and more like supporters of a woman who had successfully completed a difficult task. Within a month of the funeral, Brennan began accepting social invitations from Hamilton Crawford, the most successful banker in Lancaster County. The Crawford courtship followed a pattern that would become disturbingly familiar to anyone paying close attention to the Brennan sisters' romantic lives. Hamilton Crawford was a practical man in his late 30s, a Scottish Presbyterian who had converted to Catholicism to marry his first wife, deceased 3 years earlier from childbed fever. His bank held mortgages on half the farms in Lancaster County, and his personal wealth rivaled that of Philadelphia's merchant princes. Catherine approached Crawford with a combination of vulnerability and strength that proved irresistible to a man who had spent 3 lonely years burying himself in ledger books and loan documents. She would appear at his bank on Tuesday afternoons, ostensibly to discuss the family's financial arrangements following Thomas Hennessy's death. But their conversations gradually shifted from business to personal matters. "I worry about my sisters," Catherine confided during one of these meetings, her voice carrying just the right note of concern. "Bridget is still mourning, of course. But Margaret and Sarah, they need guidance, protection. A woman alone in this world faces so many dangers." Crawford, who had no siblings and had often wondered what family loyalty might feel like, found himself drawn to Catherine's devotion to her sisters. Here was a woman who understood that blood ties transcended all other considerations, a rare quality in his experience. Their engagement, announced in August 1838, surprised no one who had observed Crawford's transformation from grieving widower to besotted suitor. The wedding took place in October, exactly 1 year after Brennan's death and 7 months after Thomas Hennessy's funeral. Crawford moved into the farmhouse, bringing with him not only his considerable wealth, but also his expertise in financial management. Like Hennessy before him, he restructured the property arrangements to provide additional security for all 4 sisters, never questioning Catherine's insistence that the family remain together. But Hamilton Crawford was a more methodical man than Thomas Hennessy had been, and his banker's instincts led him to notice patterns that a lawyer might miss. Within weeks of the wedding, he began keeping a private journal, recording observations that would prove prophetic. November 3, 1838. Catherine insists on maintaining separate accounts for each sister's inheritance from father. Says it's temporary until they all marry. But Margaret shows no interest in suitors despite obvious beauty. Sarah actively discourages men who call on her, beginning to suspect they have no intention of marrying. November 18th, 1838. Bridget visited bank today to discuss investment opportunities. Her knowledge of compound interest and property values exceeds that of most businessmen. Asked detailed questions about inheritance laws, specifically regarding widows' rights in cases of intestate death. Claimed academic curiosity, but conversation felt calculated. December 1st, 1838. Overheard conversation between Catherine and Margaret about maintaining unity and protecting the legacy. When they noticed me listening, quickly changed subject to Christmas preparations, growing convinced that sisters have made some kind of pact regarding property. December 15th, 1838. Catherine has become distant, mechanical in her affections. Shows more interest in discussing business than in normal marital relations. When I mentioned possibility of starting our own family, her reaction was cold, almost hostile. "The 4 of us are family enough," she said. Crawford's suspicions deepened when he discovered that Margaret had begun receiving regular visits from Judge Cornelius Wittmann, the circuit judge who presided over Lancaster County's most important legal cases. Wittmann was a distinguished man in his 50s, a widower with grown children who lived in Philadelphia. He was also the judge who would oversee any legal challenges to the Brennan family's property arrangements. The banker's training had taught him to recognize patterns, and the pattern emerging around the Brennan sisters troubled him deeply. But Hamilton Crawford had made a crucial error in his analysis. He assumed that recognizing a conspiracy would be enough to protect him from becoming its next victim. The second death occurred on February 8, 1839, during one of the coldest winters in Lancaster County memory. Crawford had taken to walking the property boundaries each morning, partly for exercise and partly to inspect the farm's winter preparations. The Mill Creek, which formed the northern border of the Brennan property, had frozen solid for the first time in decades, creating what appeared to be safe passage across the water. Crawford's body was discovered by a neighbor searching for stray cattle. The banker had apparently attempted to cross the creek on the ice, which had given way under his weight, plunging him into the frigid water below. The current had carried him nearly a quarter-mile downstream before his body became wedged against a fallen log. Death by drowning, complicated by exposure to the extreme cold. Exactly what one would expect from such an accident. But Crawford had left behind his journal, hidden in his personal safe at the bank. The final entry, dated February 7th, revealed the depth of his suspicions. Catherine knows I suspect something. Her behavior has become increasingly erratic. She insists on accompanying me everywhere. Claims she's worried about my safety, but her concern feels more like surveillance. I've decided to confront her tomorrow about my suspicions regarding Thomas Hennessy's death. If something happens to me, look to the sisters. They are not what they seem. Dr. Mallister, who had examined Thomas Hennessy's body the previous year, found Crawford's death equally straightforward from a medical perspective. Drowning in icy water was a common winter hazard in rural Pennsylvania. The ice on Mill Creek, while appearing solid, had been weakened by an underground spring that created unpredictable thin spots. Crawford's body showed no signs of violence, no defensive wounds, no indication that his death was anything other than a tragic accident. Catherine's grief seemed as genuine as Bridget's had been, but observers noted that both widows appeared more concerned with practical matters than with emotional devastation. Within days of Crawford's funeral, they were meeting with lawyers and bank officials, ensuring that the family's financial security remained intact. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone willing to see it. But in a community that respected the sanctity of marriage and the tragedy of young widowhood, few were prepared to voice their suspicions aloud. Margaret Brennan's engagement to Judge Cornelius Wittmann was announced 6 weeks after Hamilton Crawford's funeral. Judge Cornelius Wittmann represented the pinnacle of Lancaster County society, a man whose legal decisions affected thousands of lives and whose social position opened doors throughout Pennsylvania. At 53, he commanded respect in courtrooms from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and his appointment to the circuit court had been seen as a stepping stone to higher judicial positions, possibly even the state Supreme Court. Margaret's pursuit of the judge demonstrated a sophistication that surpassed even her sister's previous campaigns. Rather than the direct approach Catherine had used with Crawford or the intellectual partnership Bridget had cultivated with Hennessy, Margaret employed what could only be described as a campaign of strategic vulnerability. She first appeared in Wittmann's courtroom in March 1839, ostensibly seeking advice about property law related to her father's estate. Her beauty was undeniable, but what captured Wittmann's attention was her apparent innocence regarding legal matters, combined with an intelligence that made her questions unexpectedly perceptive. She seemed like a sheltered flower who nonetheless possessed a keen understanding of the world around her. "I'm afraid I don't understand these inheritance complications, Your Honor," she said during their first private conversation, her blue eyes wide with apparent confusion. "My sisters and I simply want to honor our father's wishes, but the law seems designed to destroy families rather than protect them." Wittmann, who had spent decades dealing with grasping relatives and contested wills, found Margaret's family loyalty refreshing. Here was a young woman who put blood ties above personal ambition, who sought legal guidance not for personal gain, but to protect her sister's welfare. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond legal matters to encompass literature, philosophy, and the judge's own experiences with loss. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and his children had scattered to distant cities, leaving him increasingly isolated. Margaret's strategy was patience itself. She never pushed for personal meetings, never suggested romantic interest, never appeared to be anything other than a grateful young woman seeking a respected elder's guidance. But somehow Wittmann found himself looking forward to her visits, planning his schedule around their conversations, and gradually opening his heart to someone who seemed to understand his loneliness without taking advantage of it. The engagement announcement in May 1839 shocked Lancaster County society more than the previous marriages had. Judge Wittmann was a pillar of respectability, a man whose judgment was considered unimpeachable. That he would marry the third Brennan sister following the convenient deaths of her sister's husband struck many observers as either remarkably coincidental or remarkably suspicious. But Wittmann himself seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. Margaret brought light into his austere life, filling his house with laughter and warmth. She showed genuine interest in his work, intelligent curiosity about legal precedents, and a remarkable ability to remember details about cases and colleagues. More importantly, she shared his growing concern about the suspicious pattern of deaths surrounding her family. "I worry about my sisters," Margaret confided to Wittmann 2 weeks before their wedding. "Bridget and Catherine have been different since their husbands died. More secretive, more intense about keeping the family together. Sometimes I feel like they're planning something, but I can't imagine what." This conversation would later be remembered as either Margaret's attempt to distance herself from her sister's conspiracy or as the most calculating manipulation of all, using Wittmann's own suspicions to absolve herself of guilt while positioning herself as an unwitting victim of her sister's schemes. The wedding took place in July 1839, a smaller affair than the previous ceremonies, partly out of respect for the recent deaths and partly due to growing whispers about the Brennan family's unusual luck in love and loss. Wittmann moved into the farmhouse like his predecessors, though he insisted on maintaining his own residence in town for professional purposes. This arrangement meant he spent weekdays at the farm and returned to Lancaster for court sessions. The judge's legal training made him a more careful observer than either Hennessy or Crawford had been. Within a month of his marriage, he began documenting disturbing patterns of behavior that his predecessors had either missed or dismissed. His private notes, discovered years later, revealed a man growing increasingly convinced that he had married into a conspiracy. August 10th, 1839. Margaret insists on knowing my schedule in advance. Claims she wants to plan meals and social events accordingly. But her questions seem more focused on when I'll be traveling alone than on domestic arrangements. August 25th, 1839. Overheard Bridget and Catherine discussing the final arrangement and completing the plan. When I entered room, they immediately changed subject. Margaret's reaction was odd. She seemed frightened rather than curious. September 2nd, 1839. Found Margaret examining my will and insurance documents. She claimed she was trying to understand legal terminology, but her questions were surprisingly sophisticated. Beginning to suspect she knows more about law than she pretends. September 15th, 1839. Direct confrontation with Margaret about my suspicions regarding her sisters. Her response was immediate tears and protests of innocence. But something about her reaction felt rehearsed. Either she's a victim of her sister's schemes or a better actress than I imagined. Judge Wittmann's position gave him access to information that his predecessors had lacked. He quietly began investigating the deaths of Thomas Hennessy and Hamilton Crawford, requesting copies of coroner reports and interviewing witnesses. What he discovered disturbed him deeply. Both men had died at times when they were known to be in conflict with their wives about leaving Lancaster County. Both deaths had occurred under circumstances that, while appearing accidental, showed evidence of careful timing and opportunity. Most troubling of all, both men had made recent changes to their wills that heavily favored their wives and, by extension, the entire Brennan family. But Wittmann's investigation revealed something else. He was not the only person asking questions about the Brennan sisters. A private investigator named Daniel Murphy had been making quiet inquiries around Lancaster County, claiming to represent interested parties who were concerned about the pattern of deaths. Murphy's questions focused on the sisters' financial arrangements, their relationships with local business leaders, and their future marriage plans. When Wittmann attempted to contact Murphy directly, he discovered that the investigator had already left Lancaster County, but not before interviewing several key witnesses and requesting copies of public records related to the Brennan property. Someone outside the family was beginning to piece together the truth about the sisters' conspiracy. On October 30th, 1839, Judge Wittmann made the decision that would save or damn him. He confronted Margaret directly about his discoveries and demanded to know the truth about her sister's involvement in their husbands' deaths. Margaret's response would determine whether the fourth Brennan sister was a co-conspirator or simply another victim of her family's ruthless determination to stay together. The confrontation between Judge Wittmann and Margaret took place in the farmhouse parlor on a rain-soaked evening when Catherine and Sarah had traveled to Lancaster town for supplies, leaving the newlyweds alone for the first time in weeks. Wittmann had planned the timing carefully, understanding that his wife's behavior changed dramatically when her sisters were present versus when they were apart. "Margaret," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. "I know what your sisters have done. The question now is whether you're their accomplice or their next victim." Margaret's reaction was immediate and visceral. She collapsed into a chair, her face draining of color, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth. For several minutes, she said nothing, staring at her husband with an expression that combined terror, relief, and something that might have been gratitude. "I've been waiting for someone to figure it out," she finally whispered. "I've been praying that someone would stop them before they make me do what they did." What followed was a confession that revealed the true scope of the Brennan sisters' conspiracy. According to Margaret, the plan had been Bridget's creation, conceived during those candlelit conversations following their father's funeral. The eldest sister had calculated that 4 strategic marriages, followed by 4 convenient deaths, would not only keep the family property intact, but would also create a financial empire that could support them in luxury for the rest of their lives. "Bridget said we had to think like men," Margaret revealed, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She said, "Men use violence and politics to get what they want. But women have to be smarter, more patient." She said, "If we did it right, no one would ever suspect us because people see what they expect to see, grieving widows, not calculating killers." The confession revealed the disturbing efficiency of the sisters' methods. Each death had been meticulously planned months in advance, with contingencies for different scenarios and careful attention to creating plausible accidents. Bridget had studied Thomas Hennessy's daily routines for weeks before his death, noting his route to town, his horse's temperament, and the weather patterns that might provide cover for their actions. She drugged his coffee that morning, Margaret revealed, something that would make him dizzy, disoriented, but would be gone from his system by the time anyone examined his body. Then she spooked his horse deliberately, threw a stone at the exact moment he was riding past the steepest part of the road. Hamilton Crawford's death had required more elaborate preparation. Catherine had spent weeks studying the ice patterns on Mill Creek, identifying the exact location where underground springs created unpredictable weak spots. On the morning of his death, she had used heated iron rods to weaken the ice further, creating a trap that would appear completely natural. She walked with him that morning. Margaret continued, tears now flowing freely. She insisted on accompanying him to check the property boundaries, something she'd never done before. She guided him to exactly the right spot on the ice, then stepped aside just as it gave way. She said later that she had to hold his head under the water for nearly a minute, but the cold made him weak, so he couldn't fight her effectively. But Margaret's most shocking revelation concerned her own role in the conspiracy. She had not been an unwitting victim of her sister's schemes. She had been their reluctant accomplice from the beginning. Bridget and Catherine had made it clear that her cooperation was not optional, that the family's survival depended on all 4 sisters playing their assigned roles. "They told me that if I refused, they would make it appear that I had been the killer all along," she explained. Bridget said it would be easy to plant evidence suggesting that I had murdered Thomas and Hamilton out of jealousy or greed. They said no one would believe that three sisters could work together so efficiently, but everyone would believe that one sister had gone mad with jealousy. Judge Wittmann listened to this confession with growing horror, not only at the crimes being described, but at the realization that his own death had been planned with the same methodical precision. Margaret revealed that his murder was scheduled for November 15th, 1839, less than 3 weeks away. The method would be poisoning, using a slow-acting toxin that would mimic the symptoms of a heart attack, a plausible cause of death for a man of his age and professional stress level. Sarah has been practicing with different doses, Margaret revealed. She's been testing them on stray cats and dogs, finding the right amount that would kill quickly enough to prevent recovery, but slowly enough to seem natural. Bridget said your death had to be perfect because you're too prominent for people to accept another convenient accident. But Wittmann's investigation had uncovered another disturbing element of the conspiracy: the involvement of Daniel Murphy, the private investigator who had been asking questions around Lancaster County. According to Margaret, Murphy was not working for interested parties, as he had claimed. He was working for the Brennan sisters themselves, hired to identify anyone who might be getting too close to the truth about their crimes. Bridget wanted to know if anyone suspected us, Margaret explained. She said, we needed to stay ahead of any investigations to know what people were saying and thinking. Murphy reports back to her every week with the names of anyone who's asking questions about her family. This revelation meant that Wittmann's own investigation was known to the sisters, that his suspicions had been reported back to them, and that his confrontation with Margaret might itself be part of their larger plan. Perhaps Margaret's confession was genuine, or perhaps it was an elaborate manipulation designed to make him lower his guard at the crucial moment. How do I know you're telling the truth now? Wittmann demanded. How do I know this isn't just another layer of deception? Margaret's response would determine not only Wittmann's fate, but also whether the Brennan sisters' conspiracy would finally be exposed or would claim its fourth and final victim. She walked to the parlor desk, opened a locked drawer with a key she wore around her neck, and withdrew a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten pages. This contains everything, she said, placing the journal in Wittmann's hands. Every detail of every murder, every plan, every conversation. I've been documenting it all since Thomas's death, thinking that someday I might need proof of what really happened. As Wittmann began reading, the sound of approaching horses announced that